Thoughts of home tormented the Red, ever far from familiar surroundings. However, she had no place to which to return. Her desire to find her cousin became as steadfast as her continued lament. Until she arrived at the head of the Tisri Trail, the Red had seen no signs of Randal. There, however, she found old spoor from his pack animals. If she had remembered the length of the trail correctly, she estimated from the droppings and previous weather conditions that in 3 weeks she should catch up with him as he reached the last climbs in the pass, the 8th level. While the moons lit half the night and the stone figures guided her ascent, she could travel as fast as she could during the remainder. Well into one evening, she passed the location where Randal some time ago had spotted what was to be Turan's isolated alpine garden, high above the trail. Days later, still following the trail of spoor, Oksana crossed the camp where Herpedros had met with Randal. She did not miss the improper signs of scuffling, smudged ground and sets of deep boot marks. Since Randal and his tag-alongs had left consistent spoor and tracks, Oksana assumed a reasonable inference. Her poor cousin had met with an attacker. However, the pack animals had so obscured the soil she could not infer the number of assailants, nor could she ascertain the direction of the assault. Seeing the outlaws' traces, though, disheartened her. Had the brigands remained in her vicinity? Her spine shook, for she had become complacent and too self-assured in her own safety. She searched farther away from the scuffle as fresh caution filled her steps. Indeed, signs headed away from the trail. She cautiously followed the faint tracks inadvertently left by the desperadoes. She quelled her breathing and wound among the shadows of the jammed door, past rock slides, scrambles, and camouflaged passages. The Red followed the scant trail across a long face of smooth rock where she lost the track. Oksana scurried up and down the barren edges searching for any sign, but each endeavor proved too precipitous for man and beast. From the last sign of the crew, she drew an imaginary course across the barren face and struck out. 100 spans away, she reached the opposite side. Astonished, she found a trail but no direct signs of Randal's pack animals. When the new trail appeared to fly off into space, Oksana refitted her limited gear and crawled to ascend the steep course. To minimize her exposure, she crept up on all fours to the crux, then glanced over with one eye, head tilted. A prize of sorts lay before her. Half a league below appeared a large hollow of luscious greens and vegetables. Her eyes grew big as she counted rows of orange and yellow winter squash, tiny vines full of smart-looking berries and vine fruits, trellised grapes at the uppermost end, and varieties of young gourds the size of long bats. A portion of the ground had been recently turned over where vibrant winter greens set up residence. Oksana scanned the vicinity but discerned nothing to cause her trouble. At the sight of the full gardens, she exulted, for the trail and her stomach had been barren of food the last week. If she waited until cover of dusk's darkness to cross into the open basin, she could safely fill up and begin to replace her lost body weight. Already she had perforated 3 holes in her waist belt to readjust her tunic. With spare time to think as she waited for the collapse of day, she reflected on her disquietude. The signs of a fight at Randal's camp and the faint trail worried her. Yet she could not be underjoyed, for a trove of comestibles awaited. Nevertheless, its presence was another mystery, a garden in the middle of brigand country. Furthermore, how could such fruits and delicate vegetables survive the arrestingly cold elevation? How had these robbers become excellent gardeners? Sudden relief swept over her consternation, for the danger could not be as great as she had imagined. Bandits simply do not garden. A bandit may hide for a duration, may prepare elaborate lairs, may invent mind-bending schemes of fraud and chicanery to waylay 1 or 2 hapless victims solely to avoid the toil of simple work such as gardening. There might be danger in these climbs, she mused, but it was not due to cultivating desperadoes. Furthermore, she knew Randal's animals could not have crossed the bald rock behind her, but a man could have. Therefore, where was her cousin? Furthermore, the probability of early snow would have deterred Randal from off-trail adventure. She concluded she must retrace the old trail along Randal's path to find signs that she had missed. However, a night of feasting waited. Her anxiety declined as the sun's auroras shifted from orange to red and then violet. Each cascade of color brought dinner time closer. When darkness ruled the evening sky, a smile tickled her lips. In such bleak quarters, the remarkable provender of the vegetables excited Oksana, especially when she discovered the garden's secret life force. Where the hollow or basin capped, a natural hot spring rested from the hard, chilled earth, and through clever irrigation schemes, wreathed down on either side of the raised plots. At the end of the garden glen, the water rejoined in finger-lock fashion and disappeared into the subterranean. The genius in this system produced both water and heat for the plants. Those requiring the warmest temperatures were planted nearest the hot spring, and those requiring less at the opposite end. Happily, the temperate slough furnished a thick fog which concealed Oksana's whereabouts. Though occasionally she misplaced her step to retrieve a bootful of lukewarm water, she did not complain. All night she ate to saturate her starved frame. Her favorites: fresh greens, late-season berries, a strange green flower, soft yellow squash, and untouched wild asparagus. When she could eat no more, the red dragged her extra volume to the warmest corner for a nap. She pulled her gauntlet and tunic tighter for warmth, wavered in a semi-conscious state for a second, and then sank into sleep. 10 hours later, the light of late morning woke her. Although she had not moved all night, her slumber was poor, for the sharp ground had pinched her sides and back, and outlandish dreams intruded her self-order. She cursed herself for sleeping so long. She scanned for any possible dangers, but as before, no people were in sight. The young woman toileted and started retracing her way back to the vapid rock face. However, animal voices rode in on the stiff breeze. She dropped to the ground, using the hunting master's technique. She was all ear. She stopped breathing and consciously slowed the rhythmic thump of her heart. She allowed herself no margin of error. Again the sounds came. Straight away she recognized pack animal clatter, the most vociferous of which was the familiar bray of a temperamental burrow beast, Randal's entourage. Oksana grew excited at the prospect of seeing all. She was close to her journey's end. Within moments the red was at the lee of their shelter. Breaking free of their temporary abode, they had meandered to graze upon the choicest brush. Their tack carried Glenderry markings with traditional family ribbons tied to the harnesses. Furthermore, she recognized the old burrow beast belonging to her uncle, Pan, who would have permitted Randal to use the pet. Pan would never have sold the troublesome creature, 45 years in tooth. Although she could not remember the burrow beast's name, she patted its nose as if they were chums. Dinky bent down his huge ox-like head for a rub and permitted Oksana to scratch between his ears and soothe his protests. Clear to the red's sharp eyes, human tracks ran in two directions from the shelter. First, a pathway heavily traveled, while second, up a grassy knoll, a less used pathway. Oksana cast her lot for the former. Duly listening for others, she tiptoed down the path which led into a church of enormous boulders. However, the footpath disappeared at the base of impassable clumps. She crossed the open, worn grass and arrived at a niche between two untidy rocks sitting upon a hodgepodge of smallish boulders. The recess hooked left and opened into a cave's entrance. With her knife in hand, Oksana perused the one-chambered room for occupants. Contributing to her confusion, the sparse room possessed proof of human occupation: 2 meager bowls of winter squash left partially uneaten. Moving forward into the darkness, her feet tripped over Randal's small backpack, which he had forgotten when the hermit had abruptly disappeared behind the bogus wall less than a day earlier. She seized upon the final proof of Randal's presence and looked for signs of trouble. Yet the room was a dead end. Thus Oksana returned to the lesser path which she had not taken, hoping it led to a similar dwelling which contained her cousin. She slung Randal's pack over her shoulders, strode past the camel and burrow beast aimlessly grazing, and proceeded up the knoll. The second route was longer and more difficult to follow than the prior one. She happened to observe that the gardens where she had eaten her surfeit of grub was hidden from either path. Unexpectedly, the faint trail ended at a hopeless impediment: 2 huge boulders festooned with garlands of thorns. Another dead end? She wondered, but felt otherwise. A maxim she had learned from her early days of catechism surfaced: when faced with the impossible, choose the least improbable. She stretched out her hand, but quickly drew back in distinct pain where the spines burned her flesh. However, the gentle stress loosened a dead leaf, which landed below amid a vacancy. Bending down, Oksana noticed an opening that could not be seen while standing. A breezy gap between the nettles and thin trunks teased her curiosity, and pushing Randal's pack forward on her knees, she followed the anomalous path. 3 spans in, she found an open, narrow grotto. The light from the cracked openings above illuminated the next 20 spans as the fissure slowly constricted and formed a full-fledged cave. Without independent light, the darkness overwhelmed her lonely figure, but she continued forward, blind in the gloom. When the breeze became focused and the sound of her breathing grew in her ears, she knew the cavity had shrunk. She reached up into the blackness to determine the location of the ceiling sloping towards her, but it was too late to avoid the crash. Concealed in the darkness, the ceiling immediately turned downward. The impact between Oksana's head and the ceiling, now properly called a wall, split a knuckle's width of skin on her vibrant forehead. The stab of pain made her bellow. She cursed at the blackness as she felt the wetness of her own blood reach her eyes and then run down her nose. A piece of cloth ripped from an undergarment served as a makeshift bandage. Without aid of light, she dabbed the blood from her nose and reminded herself of her long-standing disinclination towards spelunking. She bent where she had failed to stoop and located a tunnel at her feet, which she followed. Groping here and there, she caught the distinct odor of food in the steady current. She crawled deeper until finally she stood up inside a large larder filled with sweet apples. "It is here," Turan reverently spoke as he entered the chamber. The recluse had led Randal through the mountain's belly, along winding tunnels strewn with debris which bruised Randal's feet from his missteps. As darkness swallowed up the light of their torches, Randal pulled out a spare and lit it. The puny flame could not defeat the penetrating pitch. In a radical attempt, Randal extracted a hard chunk of magnesium from a small tin of fire starter which he carried. He secured the second torch upright between 2 large rocks and dropped into its fire a small block he had saved for starting wet wood. The magnesium flared briefly, adding additional brilliance to the vast cavern. Though amused at the newcomer's ambitious determination, Turan drifted away. Randal's eyes followed the hermit's silhouette as the hermit disappeared into the confines of the cave. Once more, Randal begrudged trusting his safety in such inhospitable holes to the strange hermit. Was he a dupe to Turan's complicated ruse, conjured to waylay him? Randal tensed and instinctively touched his clothes where he concealed his dagger to double-check the difference in the weight of his left boot from the right. At the base of a ledge, the hermit stopped and called, "It is here." "My people have never seen such a sight as this place," answered the hermit's wary audience. "Ah, but they have," the recluse replied. The old man turned towards his anxious associate, whose sweaty hands manifested his misgivings. "See," said the old man, as he raised his torch above his head. The beams hit upon some object, a stone statue, standing alone. Randal drew closer to the form of a man. The flickering flames cast light on a face of undivided attention, earnestly watching some imagined object ahead. Suddenly the force of recognition hit him, and he swayed a bit in fright, for Randal beheld his own unmistakable face in the figure. "Yes, it is you, boy," the hermit reacted. "Your features, your appearance, your expression, you." Turan pulverized the word "your," as would a bully strike blows. "You have been here, or at least your people have," Turan continued. Under the image that had appropriated his likeness, Randal feverishly wrung his memories for anything useful. Randal's mother, Clea, had spoken of how his natural mother, Janaya, came to them and left Randal behind, even as his 4 older siblings remained with her. Janaya had worn a safety skirt, common among the tribes along the 4th Divide, west of Hindsfeet. Janaya, according to Clea, had talked of unrest in the mountains, but they never said more. Randal of the Lee, his formal name, grew up in Pankin in the Glenderry province by the Great Sea. In Pan and Clea's family, he was the 3rd of 4 brothers and 1 sister, yet they were not his family by birth. In late spring, Randal's birth mother, Janaya, herded her 4 worn-out children into the shop where Pan and his father worked. Karna, Si, Torin, and Bild, all boys, clung to her safety skirt as Randal, only 2 months old, rested tied to her bosom. She asked for work and instead received a home. A year later, news reached the village of Pankin that a stranger, described as a soldier who carried no weapons, had entered Bodash and asked questions about Janaya. Pan relayed the gossip to his family, but Janaya did not take it well. Having earned their trust, Janaya divulged the events prior to her stay in Pankin. In short, the conspicuous soldier had vowed to forfeit her life unless she submit Randal and all of his siblings into his custody. Naturally, she ran. Certainly, her history disturbed Pan and Clea, and they pled with Janaya to leave at once by sea with their assistance. But Janaya countered with a difficult request for Clea to take Randal, who was too young to make the sea voyage. Long into the night, Clea and Pan discussed the matter until finally they consented, with the condition that Janaya return as soon as she could. Pan arranged a fishing boat to take her and the children wherever she ordained, and a weeping mother left her young sleeping boy with his new parents. Years passed, but Janaya never returned, nor her sons. Randal reviewed the image so distinctly his own. How? He aptly asked. Although Randal's withdrawal-induced fit served as Turan's catalyst to reveal the image of his familiar, he did not plan to fully divulge its meaning until he judged Randal's reaction. Indeed, for 2 centuries, Turan had waited in quiet existence to entertain such a moment. When the bug-eyed boy recognized his own portrait in stone, the old hermit knew. It was an odd feeling, as if light had sound, Randal later recalled. After the hermit unveiled the statue, a whirring noise buzzed in Randal's ear. The chamber grew brighter, as if someone lit 1,000 torches. A mechanism in the roof, triggered by Turan, opened and slowly exposed the chamber to sunlight, in which the statue gained full size. 20 spans above Randal was the ceiling, but not more than 30 spans away was another chamber, a shaft that shot into the sky, 10 times as vast as the former. Randal looked up to investigate the expanse of blue sky. As one misjudges a step, the sight made him reel and nearly sent him into the crater. When he regained his balance, he cautiously approached the precipice of the larger hole. A series of trails spiraled down with steep, short grades, intermixed with successions of steps. "Is there no bottom?" Randal asked, as he could not discern one. "That's like asking if there's no sky," Turan smiled. Randal turned towards the hermit and asked, "Where are we?" "You are in the heart of Jamdor," replied Herpedros. "I can see that, but what kind of place is this? Who carved out those trails?" Randal asked as he pointed down. "And most of all, what is that thing down there?" Randal pointed to a second object as he spat out questions like one would objections. "You are in the soul of Tizri, below the Jambrismara. The orb is below, and the Tizrians made the objects you know not," answered the hermit in schoolmaster fashion. "Who are these Tizrians?" asked Randal. The hermit bent over, laughing. "Why, you are Tizri," he bellowed. "Perhaps," he continued, amused, "you will see one soon." Randal's discomfiture stemmed from his own ill-considered expectations of a raving hermit, who at all turns could not be trusted. "It is amazing," the hermit continued, "that the likeness so corresponds to yours." The old man turned to face the image, almost genuflecting. His mood sullied. "Seeing it so infrequently, I had nearly forgotten," he pensively continued. "When I saw your camp, my curiosity wondered what type of fool would journey in these warring times. But when the dim light struck your face, I fell with a shock. It couldn't be, but it could. It wasn't him, but it was," Turan cried as he pointed to the stone. "What you see is your own kind." Distress appeared in the hermit's face. "You!" Turan shouted and pointed his sharp finger at Randal. "You are not the soldier king. You have stolen his countenance, but you are not John the Dauphin." Randal could not believe his ears. "No," he remonstrated. "If this is John the Dauphin, why has no one else recognized my shared likeness? How can you be certain this thing is the Dauphin's image?" Living in solitude for so long had deteriorated the hermit's lucidity. "Of course you're not the Dauphin," he whispered his acknowledgement. "Nevertheless, it is your prophecy." Turan suppressed his outburst. "Your likeness. I must show you the orb." "The what?" replied Randal. "Follow me," Turan said, as he indicated downwards towards the mammoth hole. "I'm not going down there," objected Randal. "Not going?" the hermit demanded. "You have so much to see. For more than 300 years, no one else has seen the orb, and you are not willing?" "You're insane, old man," Randal retorted without stopping. "You have led me this far into who knows where. The soul of Tizri, I've never heard of Jambismara, and I've no idea how you got my likeness on that monument. Certainly I don't fancy any more surprises. You have promised me how to live in the Bohm. You said yourself you've lived there. Now is the time to call you on your word. Explain how one can survive in that desert." Without conceding to Randal's tantrum, the hermit quietly sat down on the hard rubble and peered up into his face. "Well," he paused, "it is a long account. Are you not going to sit?" Randal felt slightly foolish. Had he won? The argument ended too quickly. "First, let me explain the orb, and then I will tell you of the Bohm." "I'm right again," Randal complained aloud. "You have not compromised." Indeed, Turan had merely extended his game, and Randal was no closer to his goal. "Sit, humor the hermit," Turan smiled. "The orb rests below," the cross-legged hermit began. "It is the concealed reality of the Capra." Randal impatiently sat down. "The orb, how is it part of the Capra?" Each time Randal intruded with questions, the hermit's tail stretched longer. Rather than a prison of evil, the orb became a prison of light. Randal wanted to interrupt, but held back. The Capra's purpose was to imprison the Banes who have no natural morality. Indeed, as you or I would consider the worm of a fly, the Banes would consider us. They do not consult, they do not see us. Thus, Sanji Shubero feared the Banes. I cannot put their chaos into words. To hold the Banes, as Sanji wished, the pre-lives fashioned a hole in the fabric of time, a bubble of non-existence, if you can imagine. However, they made more than one, but did not inform the other races. How many more exist, if any, is unknown. We see them as globes of light, though indeed they are not. Randal had no idea what fever had taken the loner, whose acuity grew more questionable. In Glendory, Randal had similarly witnessed old seamen wander into saloons and boarding houses to spread similar tales of impossibility from their years-long voyages. Finished with his yarn, the hermit demanded, "Let us go see the orb." "No, I'm not convinced," Randal stopped him. "If you tell me what you know of the Bohm, then I will entertain your suggestion, but I am resolved I will go no further without payment in our bargain. All I have is your empty promise. I will put behind me all of this nonsense, this statue, and every anecdote you've spoken unless you keep your pledge." To stage his determination, Randal stood to restart. "You won't get back that way," the hermit softly spoke. Randal spun on his heels and demanded an explanation. No, you'll not be able to find your way back," the recluse attempted to answer. "There are passages which you did not regard that feed into this one. I saw you. You did not mark all the changes as we passed through, and you will not notice the correct passage on your return." Randal was in no mood to listen. The yarn and promises were traps. "You have no soul, no sane substance in you," Randal pointlessly argued. "You're alone up here in this wasteland, and you're sick with half-lives that have become your reality. You've lived on children's stories in which you wish to pull me. Lead me out of this maze, as you say. Damn you to the bone. Damnation to this Tizri." As he heaped curses upon the hermit's unchecked, vexing cheekiness, Randal's shouts rebounded throughout the chasm. They hung in the air and intermingled in odd harmonies. Randal awaited the hermit's response as the echoes faded. The hermit prepared his defense, but stopped when his ears picked up a far-off drone. The whine expanded with a tuneful quality, as if a score of choruses sang a single note, slightly off-pitch at intervals. As the alien din increased, a strange radiation filled their large hall. Already Randal's paranoia had crept beyond his comfort, thus he immediately blamed the hermit in fashioning another trick. However, the old recluse quaked too. Within seconds, the noise deafened them and forced each man to cover his ears. Before their feet, cold, tasteless clouds gushed out of the ancient chasm. The hermit closest to the ledge saw it first. A hot fireball spewed upward and raced towards the two. The hermit dove behind the statue, and Randal, with sheep-like response, followed. Although he had not seen the burst of flesh-charring fire as the hermit had, Randal understood the fear in Turan's eyes. After all, to run for cover in the wake of another's flight is a natural act. A fiery orb appeared out of the abyss and levitated above the rim. Turan and Randal in their retreat crouched behind the only obstacle between them and the chasm, that is, the statue. As they clung to its safety, the red-hot radiation drove them away from its edges. Randal rapidly calculated whether he could safely reach their exit behind him. However, his intended path stretched 20 paces parallel with the threatening blaze, time enough to burn him. He shouted his contrived plan and demanded that the hermit follow, but Turan did not hear. Indeed, Randal shook the fellow, but the burning sphere had transfixed him. Randal hesitated as the conflagration worsened. The statue blistered his hands. The smell of his singed beard choked the air around his face. He shook his guide again and shouted, "There's no choice, we must run!" But the hermit remained petrified. With his head down, Randal leapt to his feet into a dead run. Immediately, the left side of his face, the side nearest the Holocaust, burned red. When he pulled his coat up to shield it, the conflagration burned the outside of his hand. The heat-scorched ground cooked through his boots. He thought the hermit must have been dead already from the unbearable temperature. Midway through his sprint, Randal felt faint. He screamed, and as blackness filtered into his vision, he fell. At that moment, however, the noise and the heat abated, and echoes of the whirling hot air receded. Randal remained motionless, but looked back nonetheless. The formidable fire faded into a cool, blue-white orb which levitated above the giant hole. Considering the magnitude of the conflagration, its diminutive size seemed implausible. The object had raged with impossible force one moment, but the next it exhibited a settled benevolence. Randal's head cleared, and returning to his escape plan, he crawled towards the only exit. As he reached the last turn, the ball of light with dreadful swiftness fixed itself by Randal's face. When he moved, the ball floated with him. "Turn it back!" he shouted to the hermit. "Damn you, turn it back!" Randal repeated. Turan, however, was numb with fear and bewilderment. The blue-white orb had sat stationary for centuries on a three-pronged dais at the bottom of the colossal chasm. Never had he witnessed such fire. In his initial panic, he believed the orb sought reprisal for bringing the foreigner into the shrine. However, when the orb returned to its former condition and clung to Randal, Turan comprehended. "The words you spoke no doubt called the orb," Herpedros answered with excitement, though he remained behind the statue. "You have the only way to turn it back. I do not know anything in this matter," Turan shouted at Randal, stiff with fear. Randal shifted, and the orb readjusted its orbit. The hermit spoke. "Randal, my young arrival, you have instigated this abnormal performance, as I've never seen the orb burn or freely move about. Speak to it," the old man assured. "Speak to this?" Randal replied. "I speak to it. It speaks to me." The hermit acted insulted. Silence followed until Randal attempted Turan's suggestion. "Back off, white orb." The sphere remained unchanged. "Randal, it's alive. It was made thus," Turan appealed. "Ask of it." "Orb, what do you seek?" Randal implored. The orb articulated in a stuttering choruses of basses and sopranos. "What came first?" Its response baffled Randal. "First what? First what?" He called to Turan to seek clues. A catalogue of answers ran through Randal's mind. He thought of the hermit and himself, the statue, and finally the familiar joke of the chicken and the egg. But here was no joke. The hermit interrupted. "It is speaking of the beginnings. Were you not taught of the beginnings?" Randal's catechisms had taught various theological, cosmological, and historical views of the beginnings, but foremost in his mind was Tagla's story, the tale that he liked best as a child. "Our dreams, they came first." The orb whizzed with a clicking sound, and flashes spun outward from its circumference. Suddenly the spinning stopped, and a perfect octave of bass and soprano voices answered.
"The line is complete. The orb is yours."